Hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk about independence, which is the second emotional intelligence skill coming out of the self-expression competency. Last video I spoke about emotional expression, which was the first skill involved in that competency. And as always, just to briefly break down the self-expression competency itself, really it's self-perception, which was the first competency, putting self-perception into communicative action. That's what self-expression is, and it involves the three skills: emotional expression, today what we're talking about, independence, and then the third skill, assertiveness. And so success in this space kind of equates to someone who's actively telling the truth from an objective perspective, and then you have authentic and synchronistic expression in verbal and nonverbal communication. So again, as always, a quick quote kind of putting independence from an emotional intelligence perspective into relevancy. Aristotle has a quote for us, which is, "It is the mark of an educated man to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." And honestly, this quote really integrates into a lot of different emotional intelligence skills. Just having self-awareness to be able to recognize your own thoughts and entertain them as they come and they go, and then having impulse control or flexibility to have these types of thoughts and learn how to manage them, categorize them effectively, how you should be using it or not be using it, and then of course tying it into independence. Someone who can entertain a thought without necessarily accepting it is someone who's practicing, self-education rather than promoting ignorance in their own reflection and thinking. So to define independence, really it's the ability to be self-directed and self-controlled in your thinking and actions, and to be free of emotional dependency. So the ability to be independent really rests on my degree of self-confidence and inner strength, and the desire to meet expectations and obligations without becoming a slave to them, right? This is all about kind of self-regulating, operating on our own in a healthy way without having to depend on other people's expectations or obligations, and being dependent on them in an emotional manner. So kind of more description into what this looks like on a day-to-day basis. Independent people are self-reliant in their planning and making important decisions. They can basically stand on their own 2 feet. You all can kind of recognize people like that. This doesn't mean that, however, they may not seek and consider other people's opinions before making the right decision for themselves. And in the end, kind of consulting others is not necessarily a sign of dependence. But what this is even so, avoiding clinging into others in order to satisfy their own emotional needs, right? These people aren't arrogant in a way where they won't take feedback or solutions from others, or integrating it into their own kind of solution map to make their best educated decision. It's really more about having the own independence to, again, regulate that yourself and not need another person's input to be successful in whatever situation they're involved in. So kind of moving forward with that, seeing someone with high independence, hopefully taking it into your own life, it really has to do with taking charge in your own life and embracing that everything that I create or destroy in my own life is ultimately my fault. Okay, and this obviously involves a degree of risk, and so you involve yourself in a degree of risk by possibly having, especially when you're taking the fault for everything that's going right or wrong in your life. You're risking kind of self-criticism of, oh, when this went wrong, it's definitely my fault, even though it was more of an external thing. It's definitely my fault and I'm not good enough. You're taking that risk, but coupling it with 2 mindsets. First one is ultimately taking the fault for everything that goes right and wrong. And then on the flip side of that, having the attitude of, I'm sorry, this is my fault, but I forgive myself. I'm going to learn from it, and I'm not going to let it hinder me in the future. And you move past it mentally. So you're just forgiving yourself, learning from it, and moving past it. You're not holding on to what you did wrong. You're taking whatever you can from it and moving forward. And also, it's someone who's being decisive and pursuing new interests, and not stagnating or tagging along in other groups or interests just because they've been there before or because other people are doing it. Lastly, kind of here, a few ways to improve this is, to put it into more of an example, we all have the urge to constantly look to others for help. And this stems from counterproductive self-talk, okay? We're always talking to ourselves in our minds, believe it or not, and filtering what we're saying to ourselves is a huge part of self-awareness. But the urge to constantly ask someone else for help comes from that negative self-talk, that counterproductive self-talk. And dependent people are so driven by fear, the fear of making a mistake and having to live with the outcome, the fear of ridicule or disapproval for themselves or from others, fear that they will feel even more terrible and worthless than before when they tried something and it failed. But the so-called solution of turning constantly to others and not practicing independence can only amplify the self-destructing mentality or the esteem eroding feelings of incompetence, indecisiveness, and neediness. And so at the end of the day, you can, this is part of how to improve yourself in terms of independence. At the end of any day, you can recall a moment in which you were dependent, when you were asking someone else for something, right? You can go through all of the options that you had and weigh out those outcomes of the different options, and then recognize the self-talk that was happening during the decision-making process in real time. Once you begin to kind of identify how you're speaking to yourself during these particular situations in which you're asking others for help and not practicing independence, you'll begin to identify patterns, and then moving forward, you'll begin to identify triggers as to why those patterns are popping up constantly, right? The why behind the what. And so that's a huge kind of just easy self-reflection practice that you can do to improve it. And this should be a good help. Like I said before to you guys, daily kind of journal, or at least weekly journal input, is always going to increase awareness, because we're simply reflecting back on the decisions that we're making. And we always think that we're very conscious of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, but in fact, the majority of what we do is at an unconscious level. And so going back in time through journaling and becoming more conscious through reflection is the only way to kind of analyze and improve on what we've been doing in the past. So that's it for independence today. And next video, I'll talk about the third self-expression, emotional intelligence skill, which will be assertiveness. But I hope y'all enjoyed that. I hope you learned something, and see y'all next time.